Welcome to Soul Harbour. Today, we invite you to immerse yourself in a gripping cinematic story about ambition, crushing betrayal, and the profound resilience of the human heart. Get ready for an emotional journey that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last word. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Linda thought she had meticulously engineered the perfect American dream in the affluent suburbs of Chicago. After being abandoned by her deadbeat boyfriend Steve decades ago, she poured every ounce of her blood, sweat, and tears into raising her son, Mike. She sacrificed everything to send him to a prestigious Ivy League university in Pennsylvania, believing his success would be her ultimate vindication. To fund his expensive lifestyle, Linda built Elegance, an exclusive, high-end hair salon that catered to the local elite. She was a self-made woman, fiercely independent and unapologetically demanding, but beneath her polished exterior lay a deep-seated fear of losing control. When Mike unexpectedly returned home, bringing with him a quiet, unassuming girl named Natalie, the flawless facade of Linda's life began to show its first dangerous cracks. The stage was set for a conflict that would burn her carefully constructed world to the ground. The afternoon sun sliced through the custom plantation shutters of Linda's pristine living room, casting sharp geometric shadows across the imported Italian hardwood floors. Everything in this house was a testament to her relentless grind. She had built her luxury salon empire from nothing, clawing her way up from a cheap rented chair in a strip mall to owning the most exclusive beauty destination in the area. The air smelled faintly of expensive vanilla diffusers and fresh white lilies. She was wiping an invisible speck of dust from the marble kitchen island when the heavy oak front door swung open. Her heart fluttered with the familiar pride she always felt when her son, Mike, came home. He was her masterpiece, the Ivy League graduate, the handsome, broad-shouldered boy who was supposed to conquer Wall Street. But the smile froze on Linda's perfectly manicured face when she saw the girl standing nervously behind him, Natalie. The girl looked like a stiff breeze would knock her over. She was swallowed by a faded, oversized flannel shirt, her cheap canvas sneakers leaving faint damp prints on the foyer rug. Natalie had thin, mousy hair pulled into a messy knot, and she clutched a frayed tote bag like it was a shield. Linda's perfectly arched eyebrows twitched. This was not the sophisticated trust fund heiress she had envisioned for her son. This was the quiet, invisible girl she had hired at the salon out of sheer pity. A sour taste coated Linda's tongue. She forced the corners of her mouth upward, forming a razor-thin, superficial smile. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Mike beamed, completely oblivious to the silent war being declared in his mother's head. He dropped his leather duffel bag onto the bench and wrapped an arm around Natalie's fragile shoulders. The tension in the room was palpable, heavy enough to crush coal into diamonds. Linda knew right then that her meticulously planned world was about to unravel. To understand Linda's deep disdain, one had to look back at how Natalie ended up in her life. 5 years ago, Linda opened Elegance Salon, a sanctuary of mirrors, crystal chandeliers, and the intoxicating scent of Moroccan argan oil. It was a place where wealthy women paid a premium for perfection. Linda was an artist, treating every client's hair like a blank canvas. She despised mediocrity. Her staff was hand-picked, polished, and ruthless in their pursuit of beauty. Among them was Tiffany, a highly skilled but dangerously arrogant stylist who believed she was above the rules. One rainy Tuesday, Linda's best friend, Dr. Sarah, a prominent pediatrician, begged Linda to give a young, orphaned girl a chance. That girl was Natalie. Linda remembered the day Natalie walked in for her interview. She looked like a frightened sparrow entirely lost among glamorous peacocks. She had dropped her plastic portfolio on the spotless ceramic tile, scattering cheap paper certificates everywhere. Linda had rolled her eyes, heavily irritated by the clumsiness, but against her better judgment, she handed Natalie a pair of shears and a mannequin head. To Linda's absolute shock, The girl's trembling hands steadied the moment they touched the hair. Natalie possessed a rare, raw talent, an intuitive understanding of shape and movement that could not be taught. Reluctantly, Linda hired her on a probationary basis, expecting her to fail. Instead, Natalie quietly built a loyal clientele, hiding in the shadows of the salon's vibrant chaos. Now this same quiet mouse was standing in Linda's home, holding the hand of her prized son. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Linda had prepared a lavish spread of roasted duck and asparagus, served on her finest bone china. The crystal wine glasses glinted under the warm glow of the dining room chandelier. Mike sat across from her, radiating a naive happiness that made Linda's stomach churn. Natalie sat rigidly next to him, barely touching her food, her eyes darting nervously around the immaculate room. The clinking of silver forks against the china echoed like gunshots in the quiet house. Finally, Mike cleared his throat, reaching over to take Natalie's small, trembling hand. He announced with a painfully bright smile that they were getting married. The words hit Linda like a physical blow to the chest. The rich taste of the roasted duck turned to dry ash in her mouth. She stared at her son, searching his face for any sign of a joke. Finding none, she felt a cold, dark fury wrap around her heart. She had sacrificed her youth, working double shifts on swollen feet, dealing with arrogant clients just to ensure Mike had the best of everything. She had paid exorbitant tuition fees, funded his expensive city apartment, and bragged about his elite status to anyone who would listen. And this was her reward. A daughter-in-law who looked like she belonged in a soup kitchen line rather than a country club. Linda gripped her linen napkin under the table, her knuckles turning white. She managed to nod, offering a hollow, frozen congratulation. Inside, she vowed to do whatever it took to make Mike see the massive mistake he was making. Within a month, Natalie had moved into Linda's pristine home. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until the young couple found an apartment, but every passing day felt like a lifetime to Linda. The house, once a sanctuary of quiet luxury, was now contaminated by Natalie's apologetic presence. Linda waged a silent, relentless campaign of passive aggression. When Natalie tried to cook breakfast, Linda would hover behind her, loudly sighing and adjusting the heat on the expensive induction stove. She made cutting remarks about Natalie using the wrong sponges on the Teflon pans and criticised the way she loaded the premium dishwasher. Natalie bore the emotional abuse with maddening silence, shrinking further into herself. Her lower lip would tremble, her large eyes welling with unshed tears. But she never fought back. Linda convinced herself that she was being cruel to be kind. She genuinely believed she was saving Mike from a lifetime of mediocrity. Mike, meanwhile, was completely blind to the toxic dynamic. He was supposedly looking for a high-level corporate job, yet he spent his days playing video games and occasionally talking about joining a startup. Linda pushed her frustration down, blaming Natalie for distracting him. She began inviting the daughters of her wealthy clients over for afternoon tea, deliberately flaunting glamorous, educated women in front of Mike while Natalie was relegated to serving the pastries. But Mike ignored the wealthy heiresses, remaining fiercely devoted to his quiet fiancée. Linda's desperate tactics were failing, and her resentment festered like an open wound. The wedding was an insult to Linda's extravagant tastes. It was a modest, pathetic affair in a small local park, attended by a handful of Mike's college buddies and a few stylists from the salon. Linda wore an expensive navy blue silk dress, standing out like a sore thumb among the casually dressed guests. Her face ached from maintaining a fake, plastered smile for the cameras. When it was time for gifts, Linda handed Natalie a velvet box containing a thin, remarkably cheap gold necklace she had picked up on clearance. It was a deliberate slight, a clear message of her true feelings. Yet Natalie's face lit up with genuine gratitude. She immediately fastened the flimsy jewellery around her neck, touching the small golden heart with trembling fingers. She thanked Linda profusely, her eyes shining with absolute sincerity. The sheer innocence of the gesture made Linda feel a sudden, sharp pang of guilt, but she quickly buried it beneath layers of defensive pride. She watched them dance their first dance under the string lights, Mike looking down at Natalie with absolute adoration. Linda sipped her bitter champagne, her mind racing. She could not accept this defeat. She convinced herself that the marriage would not last. Mike would eventually wake up and realize he needed a woman who could navigate high society, not a girl who bought her clothes at a thrift store. Until then, Linda resolved to endure the situation, keeping a watchful eye and waiting patiently for the inevitable collapse of their foolish romance. Months dragged by, and the oppressive atmosphere in the house only thickened. Mike finally got a job, but it was not at a prestigious investment bank on Wall Street. He took a position selling commercial window fixtures. Linda was absolutely mortified. She cornered him in the kitchen one evening, demanding to know why an Ivy League graduate was wasting his elite education on a dead-end sales job. Mike avoided her piercing gaze, muttering defensively about the tough economy and wanting a low-stress environment. His evasiveness sent alarm bells ringing in Linda's head, but she chose to ignore them, once again directing her anger toward Natalie. She decided that Natalie's lack of ambition was pulling Mike down into the gutter. To escape the suffocating tension at home, Linda threw herself completely into her business. The salon was booming, but a dark cloud was gathering. Tiffany, her most arrogant stylist, had become unmanageable. She ignored client requests, experimenting with wild colours and harsh cuts without permission. The final straw came when Tiffany completely butchered a VIP client's hair, leaving the prominent socialite in hysterical tears. Linda pulled Tiffany into the back office and fired her on the spot. Tiffany did not leave quietly. She slammed her expensive shears onto the desk, her eyes burning with pure malice. She screamed that Linda was a washed-up tyrant and promised to destroy the salon's flawless reputation. Linda dismissed the threat as the desperate ranting of a dramatic child. She had no idea that the foundation of her empire was about to be violently shaken. It was a crisp, golden afternoon in late September. Linda was sitting alone in her expansive living room, watching a meaningless romantic comedy on the massive, flat-screen television. She was debating whether to drive to the upscale bakery downtown to indulge in her favourite chocolate eclairs. The house was blissfully quiet. Mike and Natalie had driven out to the countryside with friends for a weekend getaway. Just as Linda reached for her designer purse, her cell phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table. The caller ID flashed Mike's name. A soft smile touched her lips as she swiped to answer, expecting a cheerful update. Instead, she heard a sound that would haunt her nightmares forever. It was Mike's voice, but it was raw, broken, and choked with uncontrollable sobbing. "Mom!" he gasped, his breath hitching painfully. "Mom, we crashed. The car flipped." The world around Linda instantly dissolved. The expensive furniture, the warm sunlight, the sound of the television, everything vanished into a terrifying void. Her knees buckled and she slid down the cold, painted wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Are you hurt? Where are you?" she screamed into the receiver. Mike replied with a hollow, mechanical tone that chilled her to the bone. He was fine, just a few scrapes. But Natalie was not. The paramedics were pulling her from the twisted metal. She wasn't moving. The phone slipped from Linda's trembling fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. In that terrifying second, a profound sense of impending doom settled over her entire existence. The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room buzzed with a sickening, relentless hum. The air was thick with the overwhelming stench of industrial bleach and stale burnt coffee. Linda burst through the sliding automatic doors, her expensive silk blouse wrinkled, her eyes wild with sheer panic. She found Mike sitting on a cheap plastic chair, his head buried in his hands. A pristine, white bandage was taped across his forehead, stark against his pale skin. Linda threw her arms around his broad shoulders, pulling him tightly against her chest, weeping with overwhelming relief that her boy was alive. For a long moment, she selfishly forgot about the girl bleeding in the operating room. When the exhaustion finally forced them to sit in silence, the reality of the situation crashed down upon them. Hours bled into one another. They drank cup after cup of tasteless vending machine coffee, watching the swinging double doors of the surgical ward. Finally, a surgeon emerged. His green scrubs were wrinkled, and his eyes carried the heavy burden of bad news. He motioned for them to follow him into a small, sterile consultation room. The doctor spoke in a slow, measured voice, delivering the catastrophic assessment. Natalie had suffered severe trauma, shattered ribs, a broken arm, a severe concussion. But the true tragedy was her spine. The spinal cord in her thoracic region was catastrophically damaged. The doctor lowered his gaze to his clipboard, his voice barely a whisper. The surgery had saved her life, but the chances of Natalie ever walking again were virtually non-existent. She was permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The drive home from the hospital weeks later was suffocatingly silent. A specialized medical transport van brought Natalie to the house. She looked terrifyingly fragile, her skin the colour of old parchment, her bright eyes now dull and sunken. Mike carried her inside, his face a mask of grim determination, masking deep, festering panic. He placed her gently onto the bed they had hurriedly moved to the ground floor. The house, with its narrow hallways and split-level design, was completely hostile to a wheelchair. Linda watched from the doorway, her mind calculating the staggering financial and emotional costs of this tragedy. Ramps needed to be built, bathrooms required complete renovations, and expensive medical equipment had to be purchased. The sheer magnitude of the burden felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She watched Mike hover over Natalie, fluffing pillows and offering sips of water. But Linda could see the terror behind his eyes. He was a young man who wanted the world, suddenly shackled to a severely disabled wife. The resentment that had always simmered inside Linda began to boil over. Why did this have to happen to her son? It wasn't fair. She convinced herself that Natalie would be better off in a specialized long-term care facility, surrounded by trained professionals. It was the logical, practical solution. She began researching expensive nursing homes late at night, convincing herself that she was doing it for everyone's benefit, ignoring the cruel reality of casting aside a vulnerable girl who had absolutely nowhere else to go. The tension erupted late one evening in the dimly lit kitchen. Linda could not hold her tongue any longer. She cornered Mike near the refrigerator, handing him a glossy brochure for an assisted living facility. She spoke in a low, intense whisper, laying out her cold logic. She needs professional care, Mike. You are throwing your entire life away. You can't be a nurse forever. You need to focus on your career, your future. Mike stared at the brochure as if it were a poisonous snake. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched visibly. He slammed his fist onto the marble counter, the sound echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. I am not abandoning my wife, he hissed, his eyes blazing with a furious, desperate fire. Linda matched his anger, her voice rising. You are living in a fantasy. She will never walk again. You have an Ivy League degree, a whole life ahead of you. Are you going to push a wheelchair for the next 50 years? The words hung in the air, sharp and brutal. Mike's furious expression suddenly cracked, replaced by a look of sheer, agonizing defeat. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that sent shivers down Linda's spine. He backed away, shaking his head slowly. He looked at his mother with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. He didn't argue further. He just turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Linda standing alone in the cold kitchen, completely unaware that her harsh words had just triggered the catastrophic detonation of her son's carefully guarded secrets. The next morning, Linda found Mike in the hallway, aggressively shoving clothes into a large canvas duffel bag. Panic seized her throat. Where are you going? She demanded, her voice shrill with genuine fear. Mike didn't look at her. He just kept packing, his movements jerky and furious. I need to go away for a while to make some real money, he muttered. Linda scoffed loudly. Money? You have a degree from one of the best universities in the country. Just apply for a real job. Mike stopped dead. He slowly zipped the bag and finally turned to face his mother. The look in his eyes was utterly dead, devoid of any warmth or affection. I don't have a degree, Mom, he said, his voice flat and empty. The silence that followed was absolute. Linda felt the blood drain from her face. What are you talking about? She whispered. Mike let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. he confessed the whole pathetic truth. He had dropped out in his first semester. He couldn't handle the crushing academic pressure, the wealthy peers, the terrifying expectations. He had spent the tuition money she sent him on rent and cheap food, working as an Uber driver to survive. The diploma he had so proudly shown her was a cheap forgery bought in a shady subway station. Linda stumbled backward, gripping the banister for support. The room began to spin violently. Her entire life, her brutal sacrifices, her exhausting pride, it had all been built on a devastating, pathetic lie. Mike hoisted the bag onto his shoulder. Without another word, he walked out the heavy oak front door, pulling it shut with a final, echoing slam. Linda slid slowly down the wall, her legs refusing to hold her weight. She sat on the cold hardwood floor, clutching her chest as a raw, animalistic sob tore from her throat. The betrayal was absolute, cutting deeper than anything she had ever experienced. Her golden boy, her perfect investment, was a fraud. And now he had run away, exactly like his worthless father had done decades ago. She sat in the dark hallway for hours, the shadows growing long and menacing around her. From the downstairs bedroom she heard a faint, heartbreaking sound. It was Natalie, crying quietly into her pillows. The girl was trapped in a broken body, completely dependent on a husband who had just abandoned her. A strange, unfamiliar emotion twisted in Linda's gut. It wasn't the usual irritation or disdain. It was profound, agonizing pity. She slowly forced herself to stand up. She walked into the bedroom. Natalie was staring blankly at the ceiling, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her pale cheeks. Linda didn't say a word. She walked over to the bed, sat gently on the edge, and took Natalie's small, fragile hand in her own. The hand was cold, but Linda held it tightly, offering a silent promise in the heavy gloom. They were two abandoned women, left behind by the men they had loved and trusted. In that shared, devastating darkness, the thick wall of resentment that Linda had built between them finally began to crumble. Linda tried to find solace in the only thing she had left, her salon. She arrived at Elegance the next morning, desperate to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of scissors and blow dryers. But the universe was not done punishing her. Her receptionist, a bright-eyed girl named Chloe, was sitting behind the front desk, staring at her smartphone with an expression of sheer terror. "Linda, you need to see this," Chloe stammered, handing over the device. Linda squinted at the screen. It was a local Yelp page for Elegance. Her flawless 5-star rating had plummeted to a dismal 2 stars overnight. There were dozens of new horrific reviews. People claiming their hair was burned off by cheap chemicals, complaining about filthy stations, and leaving vicious comments about Linda's terrible management. Then Chloe opened TikTok. A video with tens of thousands of views was playing. It was a woman with a choppy, disastrous haircut, sobbing to the camera, claiming a stylist at Elegance had intentionally butchered her hair and screamed at her. Linda recognized the haircut. It was Tiffany's handiwork. The vengeful stylist had clearly orchestrated a massive, coordinated digital attack. Linda felt the room tilt dangerously. Her phone began to ring incessantly. Loyal clients were cancelling their expensive appointments. The foundation of the business she had built with her bare hands was being systematically destroyed in the digital arena, and Linda felt utterly powerless to stop the bleeding. Linda returned home that evening a broken shell of a woman. She walked into the kitchen, dropping her heavy leather purse onto the island, and finally let the dam break. She buried her face in her hands and wept uncontrollably. The stress of the salon, Mike's devastating lie, and the sheer loneliness of her existence crushing her spirit. She didn't hear the soft squeak of the wheelchair tires approaching. Natalie rolled into the kitchen, her face etched with genuine concern. "Linda, what's wrong?" she asked softly. Linda looked at the fragile girl in the chair. For the first time, she didn't see an enemy or a burden. She saw a fellow human being. Between heavy sobs, Linda spilled everything. She told Natalie about the fake reviews, the vicious video, the terrifying reality that her business was collapsing. Natalie listened quietly, her large eyes filled with deep empathy. She rolled closer and gently placed her hand over Linda's trembling fingers. "We will figure it out," Natalie whispered with surprising strength. "You built it once. You are the strongest person I know. You can do it again." The simple, profound kindness of the gesture struck Linda like lightning. Here was a girl whose entire life had been destroyed, offering comfort to the woman who had treated her like garbage. Linda wiped her eyes, feeling a strange, new warmth blooming in her chest. For the first time in years, she realized she was not entirely alone in the world. The following Saturday brought an unexpected ray of hope. Linda's best friend, Dr. Sarah, arrived with her son, Dr. Kevin. Kevin was a brilliant, towering orthopedic surgeon with a gentle demeanor and kind, intelligent eyes. He had heard about Natalie's condition and volunteered to help her with advanced physical therapy. He brought specialized equipment, including a heavy metal trapeze bar that he expertly bolted to the reinforced ceiling above Natalie's bed. He showed her how to grip the cold metal, explaining how she could use her upper body strength to shift her weight and prevent painful bed sores. Natalie was incredibly shy around him, her pale cheeks flushing crimson every time he spoke to her. Kevin was incredibly patient, his deep voice soothing and encouraging. He brought her specialized resistance bands and spiked reflexology massage balls. After the grueling session, Kevin pushed Natalie's wheelchair out to the backyard patio. Linda watched them through the kitchen window. Kevin was pointing at a blue jay in the oak tree, and Natalie threw her head back, laughing. A beautiful, bright sound that Linda hadn't heard in months. A sharp realization struck Linda. Kevin looked at Natalie not with pity, but with genuine admiration. He saw her spirit, not her broken spine. Linda smiled softly into her coffee mug, a radical thought forming in her mind. Perhaps Mike's cowardly departure was not a curse, but a bizarre, painful blessing in disguise. Late one evening, a fierce thunderstorm battered the windows of the house. Linda was in the kitchen brewing a calming cup of chamomile tea when a heavy, rhythmic knock echoed from the front door. She froze. It was nearly 10 o'clock. She cautiously approached the heavy oak door, gripping a small canister of pepper spray she kept in the console table. She cracked the door open, the security chain pulled taut. Standing on the porch, drenched in the freezing rain, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-flecked hair. He wore a heavy trench coat that smelled of wet wool. "Are you Linda?" he asked, his voice a deep, resonant rumble over the crashing thunder. "Who wants to know?" Linda demanded, her tone dripping with suspicion. The man wiped the rain from his rugged face. "My name is Nick," he said softly. "I am Natalie's father." Linda's grip on the pepper spray tightened. "Natalie doesn't have a father. He abandoned her before she was born. Get off my porch before I call the cops." Nick didn't flinch. He looked at her with eyes that were terrifyingly familiar. They were exactly the same shape and colour as Natalie's. He reached into his wet coat and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "I know you have no reason to trust me. Just read this. Please, give it to her if you think I deserve a chance." He slid the damp envelope through the crack in the door, turned around, and walked back into the howling storm, leaving Linda staring after him in stunned silence. Linda sat at the kitchen island, the only light coming from the small pendant lamp above. She stared at the damp envelope for a long time before carefully slicing it open with a paring knife. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly blurred by the rain. Nick poured his heart out onto the pages. He revealed that he was a police detective. Decades ago, he had fallen deeply in love with Natalie's mother during an extended undercover assignment in her city. He had every intention of marrying her, but when he went to propose, Natalie's bitter, controlling grandmother had intercepted him. She viciously lied, claiming her daughter was already engaged to a soldier returning from deployment, and showed Nick fake photographs to prove it. Crushed and bound by a twisted sense of honor, Nick walked away, never knowing that the woman he loved was pregnant with his child. It wasn't until a recent investigation involving old hospital records that he stumbled upon the truth. The letter was desperate, raw, and bleeding with profound regret. He knew about the horrific car crash. He knew about the paralysis. He just wanted to help his daughter in any way possible. Linda lowered the letter, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She understood the destructive power of toxic parents all too well. She had almost ruined her own son's life with her crushing expectations. Nick wasn't a monster. He was a victim of a cruel lie, and Natalie desperately needed a family. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Linda's phone shattered the silence of the dark bedroom. She groggily answered, the harsh voice of Chloe, her receptionist, screaming through the speaker. "Linda, it's the salon. It's gone. It's all gone." Linda didn't even remember getting dressed. She drove through the deserted suburban streets like a madwoman, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. When she turned the corner onto the main commercial avenue, the sky was glowing a sickening, bright orange. Fire trucks blocked the street, their flashing red and blue lights painting the nearby buildings in chaotic colours. Thick, acrid black smoke billowed into the night sky. Elegance was completely engulfed in raging flames. The heat was so intense, it forced Linda to step back. She stood on the wet asphalt, watching the expensive crystal chandeliers melt and crash to the floor, watching the custom Italian leather chairs turn to ash. Her entire life's work, the physical manifestation of her survival, was being erased from the earth in a matter of minutes. The fire chief approached her, his face covered in soot. He shook his head grimly. "Looks like an accelerant was used." "This wasn't an accident, ma'am. This was arson." Linda collapsed onto the curb, wrapping her arms around her knees. The digital attacks, the fake reviews, and now this. Someone had systematically destroyed her. She sat in the ashes of her empire, the smell of burning chemicals searing her lungs, feeling utterly, profoundly defeated. For 3 days, Linda barely moved from her living room couch. She stared blankly at the wall, ignoring the constant ringing of the phone from insurance adjusters and police detectives. The salon was a total loss. The insurance payout would barely cover the massive debts and the cost of the commercial lease. She felt a deep, terrifying emptiness, as if her very identity had been burned away in that fire. But the silence of the house was broken by the rhythmic, determined squeak of a wheelchair. Natalie rolled into the room, her face pale, but her jaw set with fierce determination. She had been pushing herself on the trapeze bar, her upper arms visibly trembling from the effort. She rolled up to Linda and grabbed her cold hands. "You are not allowed to give up," Natalie stated, her voice stronger than Linda had ever heard it. "They burned down a building, Linda. They didn't burn down your talent. Your hands still know how to create beauty. You still have your mind." Linda looked at the girl. Natalie had lost her mother, her legs and her husband, yet she was fighting every single day just to sit up straight in a chair. The profound resilience radiating from Natalie struck a spark in the dark cavern of Linda's soul. The ashes of her old life were still smouldering, but right there, looking into her daughter-in-law's fierce eyes, Linda realised that she still had something worth fighting for. She squeezed Natalie's hand back, a small, determined flame igniting in her chest. The next afternoon, Linda received a text message from Mike. He wanted to meet at a cheap, greasy diner on the outskirts of the city. Linda arrived to find him sitting in a cracked vinyl booth, looking exhausted and nervous. He couldn't meet her eyes as she slid into the seat across from him. The smell of old frying oil and stale coffee hung in the air. Mike fidgeted with a sugar packet, tearing it to shreds. "Mom, I'm not coming back," he mumbled. "I got a job managing a warehouse, and Alison is pregnant. The bartender I told you about. We're moving in together." He finally looked up, his eyes defensive. "I'll send money for Natalie when I can, but I can't be her nurse. I have a new family now." Linda stared at the boy she had worshipped for 24 years. She saw the cowardice, the selfishness, the absolute lack of moral fibre. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The burning anger she expected was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "You're exactly like your father," Linda said softly, her voice slicing through the diner's ambient noise like a scalpel. "You run when things get hard. Keep your money, Mike, we don't want it. And don't you ever contact Natalie again. You have done enough damage." She stood up, dropped a $20 bill on the table to cover his cheap coffee, and walked out without looking back, severing the toxic cord that had bound her to him forever. Returning home, Linda knew she had to break the news to Natalie. She found the girl sitting by the window in her wheelchair, sketching a beautiful, intricate hairstyle in a leather notebook. Linda pulled up a chair and gently took the notebook away. Taking a deep breath, she told Natalie everything about the meeting at the diner, about Alison, the pregnancy, and Mike's final, cowardly abandonment. Natalie didn't scream. She just closed her eyes, and a single heavy tear rolled down her cheek. Catching the afternoon light, Linda reached out and pulled the fragile girl into a fierce, protective embrace. Natalie buried her face in Linda's shoulder, her small frame shaking with silent, devastating sobs. Linda stroked her hair, rocking her gently. "I am so sorry, sweetheart. I am so sorry I raised a coward," Linda whispered into the quiet room. "But listen to me. You are not alone. You will never be alone. You are my daughter now. Do you hear me? You are my daughter." Natalie gripped Linda's shirt tightly, nodding against her shoulder. In that profound moment of shared grief, the toxic dynamic of mother-in-law and unwanted bride vanished completely. They were forged together in the crucible of Mike's betrayal, emerging as a unified force, bound by a love stronger than blood. That evening, while Natalie was calming down with a cup of hot tea, Linda decided it was time to reveal the final secret. She walked into the kitchen, retrieved the slightly wrinkled envelope from the drawer, and handed it to Natalie. "A man came to the door during the storm a few nights ago," Linda explained softly. "He left this for you." Natalie frowned, recognizing the police department emblem on the stationery. She pulled out the letter and began to read. Linda watched as a chaotic storm of emotions washed over Natalie's pale face. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a desperate, profound longing. When she finished reading, her hands were trembling so violently the paper rattled. Is this real?" she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "He says he didn't know. He says my grandmother lied to him." Linda nodded slowly. "He came to the door in the pouring rain, Natalie. He looked at me with your exact eyes. I think he is telling the truth, but it is entirely your decision. If you want me to throw it in the fireplace, I will do it right now." Natalie stared at the handwritten words, her thumb gently tracing the blue ink. She had spent her entire life wondering why she wasn't good enough for her father to stay. To know that he had wanted her, that he had been tricked, shifted the very axis of her universe. "I want to meet him," she whispered, looking up at Linda with terrified, hopeful eyes. Linda orchestrated the meeting at a quiet, upscale coffee shop downtown. She arrived early to scope out the location, her protective instincts on high alert. When Nick walked through the glass doors, Linda felt a strange sense of reassurance. He didn't look like a deadbeat. He looked like a hardened detective carrying a heavy burden of sorrow. He sat across from Linda, ordering a black coffee, his large hands resting anxiously on the wooden table. "Thank you for giving me this chance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will do whatever it takes to make things right." Linda looked at him sternly. "She is incredibly fragile right now, Nick. Her husband just abandoned her. If you break her heart again, I will personally make you regret it." Nick nodded solemnly, accepting the threat. "I promise you, Linda, I am here for good." Then his detective instincts kicked in. "I heard about your salon. The arson. The police report says there are no leads, but I have resources. I owe you my life for taking care of my daughter. Let me look into this. I promise you, I will find the cowards who did this to you." Linda felt a surge of unexpected relief. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to fight a war completely alone. She nodded, sliding a piece of paper across the table with the names of Tiffany and the rival salon owner. "Start here," she said coldly. "Bring them down." The reunion took place in Linda's living room. The afternoon light cast a warm, golden glow across the floor. Natalie sat in her wheelchair, nervously smoothing the fabric of her dress, her breathing shallow and rapid. Dr. Kevin happened to be there, having just finished a therapy session, and he stood quietly in the corner, offering a supportive, grounding presence. When the doorbell rang, Linda opened it to let Nick inside. He stepped into the foyer, took his hat off, and froze. He stared at the beautiful broken girl in the wheelchair, and the hardened detective immediately began to weep. He crossed the room and dropped to his knees in front of Natalie's chair. "My God, you look exactly like your mother," he choked out, gently taking her trembling hands in his own. Natalie stared at the rugged, crying man, recognizing her own features mirrored in his face. The walls she had built around her heart shattered instantly. She leaned forward, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, sobbing into his shoulder. "Dad," she whispered, the word feeling strange and terrifyingly wonderful on her tongue. Linda stood by the door, tears streaming down her own face, watching a fractured family heal. She glanced over at Kevin, who was wiping a tear from his eye, looking at Natalie with a depth of affection that made Linda smile. The house, once a battleground of resentment, was finally filled with genuine, profound love. 2 weeks later, Detective Nick delivered on his promise. He arrived at Linda's house with a grim smile of satisfaction. Using his extensive network, he had pulled traffic camera footage from the night of the fire, tracking a suspicious vehicle 3 blocks away from the salon. The license plate belonged to Preston, the arrogant owner of a rival salon called the Glamour Room. Further investigation uncovered a digital trail of payments from Preston to Tiffany, paying her to sabotage elegance from the inside, post the fake Yelp reviews, and orchestrate the viral TikTok. The arson was Preston's final, desperate attempt to eliminate his competition entirely. Nick handed Linda a copy of the police report. "They arrested them both this morning. The insurance company is processing the arson claim as we speak. You're going to get a massive payout, Linda. Every single penny they owe you." Linda stared at the documents, a profound sense of vindication washing over her. The dark cloud that had suffocated her for months finally broke, letting the sunlight pour through. She looked at Nick, gratitude swelling in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Nick smiled warmly. "You gave me my daughter back. It's the least I could do." With the insurance money guaranteed, Linda felt the familiar, thrilling spark of ambition ignite in her soul. She wasn't just going to rebuild elegance, she was going to build something entirely new, a legacy that truly mattered. The rebuilding process became a beautiful, chaotic family project. Linda found a bright, spacious commercial property in a trendy, vibrant neighborhood. The smell of fresh paint, sawdust, and ambition filled the air. But she wasn't making the decisions alone. Natalie, discovering a brilliant eye for interior design, drafted the blueprints from her wheelchair. She designed custom, lowered styling stations so that she could eventually work comfortably from her chair. Dr. Kevin was there every weekend, covered in drywall dust, carrying heavy boxes and installing specialized accessibility ramps with a massive smile on his face. Nick utilized his contracting buddies to fast-track the renovations. One late evening, while everyone was eating pizza on the floor of the unfinished salon, something miraculous happened. Kevin was massaging Natalie's legs, a routine part of her therapy to maintain muscle tone. Suddenly, Natalie gasped, dropping her slice of pizza onto the paper plate. "Kevin, do that again," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. Kevin gently squeezed her right calf. Natalie stared at her foot. Slowly, agonizingly, her big toe twitched. It was a microscopic movement, barely visible to the naked eye, but it hit the room like a nuclear explosion. Kevin looked up, his jaw dropping. Linda covered her mouth, bursting into tears of pure joy. The impossible was happening. The damaged nerves were slowly, miraculously fighting their way back to life. 6 months later, the grand reopening of the new salon coincided with Linda's 50th birthday. The new space was a masterpiece of modern, accessible design, bathed in warm, natural light and smelling of expensive orchids. The waiting area was packed with loyal clients who had eagerly returned, completely ignoring the old, debunked scandals. Linda stood near the reception desk, wearing a stunning, tailored sapphire blue velvet dress that highlighted her fierce, renewed energy. She surveyed the room, her heart swelling with an overwhelming sense of triumph. She watched Nick laughing with Dr. Sarah near the espresso bar, a budding romance clearly forming between the detective and the paediatrician. Then the crowd parted slightly. Natalie emerged from the back hallway. She was not in her wheelchair. Supported by a sleek, custom-designed carbon fibre cane and leaning heavily on Kevin's strong arm, she took slow, deliberate steps across the polished floor. She wore a beautiful emerald gown, her hair styled to absolute perfection. The entire room fell silent, watching the sheer courage radiating from the young woman. Linda felt tears prick her eyes as Natalie smiled radiantly, her face glowing with genuine happiness and undeniable strength. Kevin looked at Natalie with a fierce, unwavering devotion that proved he was nothing like Mike. He was a man who stayed when the storm hit. As the string quartet began to play a lively tune, Linda's smartphone buzzed in her velvet clutch. She pulled it out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Mike. "Mom, happy birthday. Things are hard here. Alison left. I miss you. Can I come home?" Linda stared at the glowing words, feeling a strange sense of detachment. A year ago, she would have rushed to save him, to fix his mistakes, to shield him from the consequences of his own cowardly actions. She looked up from the screen. She saw Natalie laughing, leaning into Kevin's embrace. She saw Nick toasting with a glass of champagne. She saw the beautiful, thriving business they had built together from the ashes of betrayal. She realized that family was not defined by blood or obligation. It was defined by loyalty, sacrifice, and the courage to stay when everything falls apart. Mike had made his choice, and now he had to live in the reality he had created. Without a trace of hesitation or regret, Linda swiped her thumb across the screen and pressed block caller. She slipped the phone back into her purse, a profound, unshakable peace settling over her soul. She walked into the centre of the room, raising her crystal glass to the people who truly mattered. She had lost her false perfection, only to find a perfectly beautiful reality, and she was finally, wonderfully complete. The evening progressed into a joyous celebration of life and resilience. The new salon, appropriately named Phoenix, was alive with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Linda walked over to Natalie and Kevin, enveloping them both in a warm, tight hug. "You look absolutely breathtaking, my darling," Linda whispered into Natalie's ear. Natalie beamed, gripping her cane tightly, but standing tall. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Linda. You gave me a reason to fight." Kevin smiled, wrapping a protective arm around Natalie's waist. "I think we all saved each other," he said softly, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute certainty. Nick joined the circle, raising his glass of sparkling cider. "To second chances," the grizzled detective said, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he looked proudly at his daughter. "To second chances," the group echoed in unison. Linda looked around the brightly lit room, taking in the scent of fresh flowers and the vibrant energy of her friends and chosen family. The brutal trials of the past year had burned away all the superficial arrogance and petty judgments that used to define her. She had been broken, her empire destroyed, her heart betrayed by her own flesh and blood. But in the ruins she had discovered her true strength. She had found a daughter, a trusted partner, and a renewed passion for her art. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky brighter than she could have ever imagined. As the party began to wind down and the last of the guests filed out into the cool evening air, Linda stood alone for a moment in the centre of her beautiful new salon. She ran her hand over the smooth, custom-built styling stations, feeling the solid wood beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath of the fragrant air. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the devastating arrogance, the crushing betrayal, the terrifying fire, and the miraculous, agonizingly slow recovery. She realized that true beauty wasn't found in flawless facades, expensive degrees, or perfectly manicured lives. True beauty was forged in the fire of adversity. It was the courage to rebuild when everything was lost. It was the grace to forgive oneself and others, and the strength to love fiercely, even when it hurt. Linda opened her eyes, a serene, confident smile playing on her lips. She turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow of the emergency exit signs. She walked out the front door, locking it firmly behind her, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. Her reflection in the glass door showed a woman who was no longer afraid of the dark, because she had finally learned how to be her own light. The nightmare was over, and the real, beautiful dream was just beginning. And so, Linda's story reminds us that sometimes the destruction of our perfectly planned lives is the only way to build something truly authentic. From the devastating betrayal of her son and the literal ashes of her empire, she found a love and resilience she never knew existed. Natalie's miraculous recovery and the forging of a chosen family prove that our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of strength. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. If Linda and Natalie's story touched your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to Soul Harbour for more cinematic tales, and drop a comment below. We want to know, how would you react if the person you trusted most betrayed you in your darkest hour? Share your thoughts, and we will see you in the next story.